My name is Kevin Stultz. I'm a director of product management for Symantec. And for the past, I would say a little over a year, I've been doing a fair amount of research into containers and what they mean for security. I think it's really going to be a game changer. And today, if you get nothing else out of this session, what I want you to understand is that security with containers is different. I have talked to many customers who look at a container and say, hey, it's just another virtual machine, and it's not. And I want to make sure that that comes across. So to jump right into it, one of the really interesting things to me is just how quickly containers are coming. So as you're all probably aware, we first went from physical machines to virtual machines. They started stamping it out. They would sit in dev environments. We were 3-4 years in with containers where it sat just in dev environments before it started to really come into production. And nothing really changed, right? Things went a little faster, but the way I fundamentally did things in the data center and fundamentally the way I secured things was exactly the same. And then we went to cloud, right? And cloud is growing faster than public cloud, is growing faster than the private cloud did. But again, the fundamentals of how I secure things change. They are speeding up, but they stay the same. And then containers came along. And what amazes me about these statistics when you go researching into this company called Datadog, and what they do is they monitor active websites, look at what technology they're using and what they're doing, right? And over the course of just a couple years, 12% of the internet and growing is now sitting on a container. So if you connect to a website, 12% of what's out there is in a container. And the other thing that's really surprised me is normally when I go out and talk to customers about new technology, it's the small guys that are out there saying, yeah, we're trying out the new technology, we're living on the bleeding edge. Here it was the largest financials, right? And my typically slowest groups to want to move and adopt new technology that started coming to me and saying, hey, there's this new thing in my environment. I got to figure out what I do with it. And when I look at containers and just what's happening, right? Containers take the challenge of the operational model of security and take it a very different route than what we're used to. So with private cloud, right? And I grabbed these statistics, they came from various blogs, right? And what you're seeing is initially you used to see 100 servers per admin. They understood the box. They would have a regular cycle. They would hit those boxes and you would run a process where you would take the server, you would build the OS, you would hand it off to an application team. The application team installs their stuff on it. You'd hand it off to the security team. They'd install their stuff on it. And then you would go live, right? And it was a several-month process in a lot of companies. Public cloud started to change that, right? People just go out to a marketplace. They click on a server. It fires up. And we started to need to build automation to automate these processes, right? How do I set these things up? How do I have my security into it? And you started to hear some talk about embedded security. And to me, embedded security comes into where when a customer, rather than having it passes from team to team and then goes live, you start to hear about a group called DevOps, right? And you'll hear terms like Puppet, Chef, Ansible as some of the tools people are using. And what this is about is these tools initially, they grew up out of a need to spin things up quickly. And their first focus was simply, how can I quickly spin up a workload, put all the things on that workload, and keep that workload consistent? Because if I'm managing 500 servers as an admin, I can't go log into each one and figure out that somebody installed the old version of Java here, the new version of Java here, and that's why my app broke, right? So they were designed around that. But then when you came to security, the challenge became is, how do I keep up? Right? I need the security tool there. I need it to be doing its thing. And so now what you're starting to see is DevOps coming to security and saying, how do I make sure that the security controls get embedded into the workload? So when I spin up a new workload, be it a container or a server, the security is just there, right? If I got network rules I want to apply to it, it needs to be part of my actual DevOps scripts that are spinning this up. So when I look at this first, before I dive into this, how many are familiar with containers? Worked with Docker, Cloud Foundry sounds familiar? Good, it looks like about half of you, so I'm hoping for some great feedback as we get into it. For those of you who aren't familiar with containers, I want to run through this because what I find is when I go talk to people about this, there's a lot of, oh, it's just another virtual machine, right? It's just a smaller version of that, right? And it's actually a very different paradigm to the way you run systems. So when you look at a standard application, the way things were done pre-applicator is you either had a set of servers or a set of virtual machines. And in each case, I'm managing an operating system on each layer, right? And when I'm looking at this, I drew this out as what you're seeing in containers. A lot of these are being used for building customer-facing apps. You have, like in the old world, is F5s up front. You then have a web, you've got IIS, Apache, HTTP, a web application service, and you may have a middle tier, but then behind that you've got a database, and you've got some number of servers here, and you're managing the operating systems on this, and you're doing the old thing, right? You install all the various applications as well as their dependencies, right? And there were a lot of challenges in this world of, I'm managing all these, right? I've got 100 of these guys I'm managing. Did I make sure that I applied the patch to all? Right? Or I told the patch to roll out and it applied to 4 of the 5 and the 5th one it didn't take. The app's acting funky. How do I go track this down? Right? So there were a lot of challenges with maintaining consistency, and there's a lot of overhead. And containers are really about, can I get rid of this overhead? Right? If I am building a web application service and all that server is designed to do is serve web pages or serve data to a mobile application on a phone, I don't need all these other services underneath. Right? When you have an OS, there's a whole lot of various services that are there that are doing nothing to serve the purpose. So the whole concept of a container, you'll hear a lot of times people talk about it as a microservice. I like to think of it and describe it. I know it's not all containers. Think of it as a single process that does a function. Right? Nginx is an example. It's the most popular one out there today, and it's used as a proxy server, can also be used as a reverse proxy server. Its sole job is a process that takes in data and processes it and proxies it on back, right? And that's all it does. And that's all there is, instead of having an entire box with all the pieces of Linux that I am booting all these startup scripts, running SSHD, and all the other various processes. It is a single process. And the other key to it is they have made this a community in making things simpler and faster. So there's something called a Docker hub or a registry. And I always like to make sure I point it out. It is not a registry like you think about on Windows. I've had quite a few conversations trying to differentiate, but it is a repository that holds all these different types of containers, right? There's all the people who write these, publish them. There's official ones out there. There's unofficial ones out there. So the ones I've got icons on this slide, what you're seeing, Nginx is a standard proxy server. HTTPD, the Feather, is the most commonly used web container. Mongo, MySQL are neck and neck in being the most popular container to be the database backend. And the way these fire up is you don't have a process where I install an operating system, right? There is no operating system in this container. It is simply the piece of software that's performing that function. There's no installation, right? The way you actually instantiate this, you run Docker run and the name of the container you want to run, right? And it's even got version control capabilities where I can say Docker run this particular version. And you then can actually go out into the hub and see what it pulled down, and the writers of these put a full write-up of how to use them. There's a great community out there to support to get this up. But the key here is I have no installation and no application dependencies. It's completely encapsulated. So when I fire up HTTPD or pull down MySQL, all the pieces that it needs is completely encapsulated. And that solves a lot of problems if you're the app developer. I don't have to worry about the right versions of Java underneath and the right versions of other things being kept in sync. And the other paradigm that changed when I switched to a container world is the fact that patching goes away. So if I go on and think about this, how do I now deal with security in a standard application? The first thing I do is I install my security tools, right? What are the security tools that are the ones from my environment? What are the ones that I use to monitor things, to enforce my security controls? I then make sure it goes into my regular patch cycle. Every month, we roll out patches for the OS. Here's how we roll out patches for the application. And then I harden the OS in the app, right? What are the rights it doesn't need on the OS, et cetera. In a container world, again, there's no operating system. And this, I keep saying this because I've had multiple customers who took the approach of, well, we're going to do containers, and they grabbed the full OS. You can go grab Debian, Ubuntu, Red Hat, and run those as containers, right? And so I had one company that rolled this out. They had 400 of these containers, and they hey, yeah, a container should just be another virtual machine. And us and Docker got on the phone to them after they went through much fun of trying to install the software security tools and patch all this, because they were completely missing the value of the container, and they had completely hamstrung their DevOps guys who were trying to do it right. The key is a container is just a microservice you're trying to run. You don't install security tools. You don't install anything inside the container, right? It is a container. It is designed to do one thing. You don't patch. The way you deal with a container is if I need the new version of Nginx, I spin down my current one, right? There's a Docker command to shut it down, and I spin up the next one I need to run, right? There isn't I go and apply patches. And what you'll see in environments, a lot of these are running what they call a dev, a stage, and a prod. And essentially, they run a script, and the most mature customer I've got has one that fires up a full stack, and it's a total of 50 containers, right, that manage their entire environment. They test it in the end, and in the ready, they are rolling the ones off of production. So they will roll one of the HTTP downs, roll a new one up, roll one down, roll one up, so that there's no interruptions. They're basically using Nginx to stop the traffic as they move their way across the environment. And the other thing and misconception that I want to make sure I clear up today is when security comes knocking on the door and finds out about these things, some of the people don't like security too much. They're those annoying guys, right? And they're saying, hey, my container's good. It's contained, right? There's nothing that can happen. Inside HTTPD, it just does its thing. Don't worry about it. And then we say, well, what about the fact that 86% of the stuff that's on Docker Hub has vulnerabilities in it? Well, no, it's contained. Well, what about the data behind it? Well, it's okay, right? So I want to cover some of that in detail as we go through this and talk about the use cases I'm hearing from customers, and then I want to open it up and hear what are your use cases, because the key to me is with this being a very new technology to share what everybody's learning as a community and figure out what's the best way to approach containers. So what you're seeing here, what I did is I took all the use cases that I've been talking to customers about, and we've been working with them as we've been working on this project, and put them into buckets. And what you're looking at, first of all, on the left-hand side is a typical environment when I talk to customers, and the icons here are just the most popular ones on the Docker Hub. And so what you'd heard me talk about Nginx. It's used as a proxy or a reverse proxy for an application. You see WordPress, HTTPD, Mongo, MySQL as a database, and then there's always a set of tools. Right? You have a Docker registry, and this is an internal registry, or what are the containers you use within your environment. And many customers have wanted to talk to me about BusyBox. Think of BusyBox as a set of Unix tools. Because I don't have Unix tools inside the containers, there's just a process. There are still things I can do to manage the containers. And it tends to be BusyBox as a set of Unix tools that the DevOps team will use to manage their environment, make changes to their environment. So as a whole, let's just dive right into it. So we're going to talk about visibility. CISOs and everybody's got to worry about how do I do compliance? How do I harden these without putting something in the box? And then isolation. Are they really isolated? And how do I isolate them? So the first one, this was actually my very first call on this, where I started researching this a little year over year. We got a call from a CISO at a publishing company that says, I've got a problem, right? I've got my SOC. They called me. There's some suspicious activity out here on the network. And the analyst came to me and said that there isn't a server, right? He says he found it. He traced it back. The server admin says no such beast. They did a little more digging. And it turns out there's this new thing called a container. And my analyst said, well, I pull the syslogs from the box, right? I want to get the details of what was going on in the box. What were the users on the box? And was told there's no such thing, right? There is no syslog. There is no user and password file on this box. And then, by the way, this is a new customer-facing mobile app that we're building, and we're going to have username, password, and we're going to store this, and it's eventually going to be used to do transactions. And needless to say, they weren't pleased with what do I do, right? So the key here on visibility, right? There are a number of solutions to this, right? The key is, in the best organizations I've talked to, it's all about DevOps, right? They have a very well-defined, here is my dev, stage, and production, right? And the most mature one that I'm working with is dealing with where they go down to the checksum level, to where they basically have hashes to say, security team, here are the hashes of what I'm running on production. The nice thing about Docker and the registry is the fact that with those hashes, I can go back and get all the details on that particular container. What are its risks? What do I need to worry about? And the other key here is there are now starting to be tools. Docker has released one that lets you manage it on above. Cloud Foundry, you may have heard of, they're basically a management layer above a competing technology called Warden or Garden, depending on how old the containers you use, that allows you to have that visibility of what are my containers, what was up, what was down. The one thing I will say that hasn't been solved and continues to be a problem in this space is even customers that have moved to those tools that sit above, you're reliant on that the DevOps is using them, right? And not just issuing Docker run commands down underneath them, because they're basically a layer sitting above. So the next one is compliance, and I've had a lot of compliance things come to me. So the first, I thought the best way to talk about this was break it down. So first, when you think about, I want to move it production, and the CISO I was talking to said, when this goes production, how am I going to deal with it? So first, what's the same? The first, there is security best practices for the host. I am very impressed with that CIS wrote up on the security benchmarks for Docker. They did a really nice job of here are the things you should configure. Here are the files you need to make sure you watch and make sure nobody's touching them because they can own your system, right? So that definitely go out and grab that. The CIS benchmark is actually very well done, one of their better documents. What needs to change, right? Vulnerability assessment. This is not something you have to change, but those who haven't changed their process are really struggling. The key being, a lot of these containers don't last more than a few hours, right? I've got one, they cycle them every day. They make sure that everything gets cycled. So if I run a vulnerability assessment, right, it's gone by the time it's done, right? By the time you send the guy to go figure out and do things, it's already gone. But the key is you can assess the registry, or some of them basically are assessing stage of what they're trying to go into production. So there are still ways to look at it without going assessing registry. And they asked me to talk, stay away from tools. I will say that we're in this space. There's a company called Twistlock in this space. Docker just released something in this space. So I think you're going to see the security vendors like ourselves coming to this space, right, to be able to offer things. But be aware, you certainly don't want to think of it as I assess these, right? They're a process. You want to assess the actual registry. And the other key to that I'm seeing a lot of is enforce internal registry use. And what I mean by this is with Docker, I have the ability to say Docker run and then go grab. And what it first does is it checks its own, and then it goes out to Docker's public site and can grab anything that's posted. And anybody can post things up there, right? Docker's doing some policing, but it's not like the Apple Store where it's very tightly policed. So what we're seeing is a number of them will say dev ops. Your dev environment, you can go do your dev and grab what you want, but before you can move it to stage, it has to go on our internal Docker registry, and they're the only things you can allow to run anything outside of dev, right? And so that allows you to still have control. You're not been shackling DevOps from being able to get their job done, but you're making sure you know and have assessed what are the actual containers are going to run in the environment. And on what must change, really the most critical is DevOps, right? I have talked to a number of customers who are trying to take their old processes of build it, install it, hand it over, security does it. That will not work in a container world, right? You can do things to tweak it and make it faster, but to do this, you have got to integrate security into DevOps, right? So really the key when you get to containers is find your DevOps group and talk to them. And why that comes in, not only, certainly Symantec, we're here providing tools focused on how do I monitor and do all these things, but even with ours, right, you need it orchestrated into DevOps. So if they want to put in rules and enforce internal registry use, that's not something where you're going to call a security guy when they get done and implement it, right? It needs to go into the DevOps script to actually apply those rules, whether it be Symantec's tool, AppArmor that's down in underneath, IP tables. It's all got to be looked at as a integrate into the DevOps process. Finally, hardening, right? How do I apply security without tools in the environment? The one thing to understand is with this, it is sitting on a layer. It's called C groups, or basically allowing you to run mini VMs inside. You can still, at an OS level, at AppArmor level, IP tables level, see what's going on above. And this is what you want to do. So, right, so the first one is limit registry access to sanctioned servers is the most common. And this is doing firewall, either IP tables, or there are a number of ways to do application level firewall where I can limit the Docker process to say it can only go to this one internal place to go get its images, but the rest of the containers can go where they want to go, or IP tables levels. Right, limiting containers allowed in the environment. We're getting a number of them saying, I don't want BusyBox. BusyBox cannot be anywhere outside of stage because of all the various things it do, and they're worried about risks of somebody exploiting it, right? And this is where you're doing app control. I just had a couple last week who are saying, my auditor is stating that I can't mix them. They're trying to, the PCI audit that says only one thing per box. I'm not saying I agree with this, but they're looking at things where they say I can only run HTTP servers on hardware 1, I can run MySQL on hardware 2, and so on. I'm seeing a fair amount of that segregation, and you certainly can do that with, obviously my tools or the ones built in. There are some things with AppArmor and SE Linux where I can enforce those controls, right? I'm enforcing it at the OS layer because in reality, these containers are processes that are sitting above. And then limiting only required functions. The most common question I'm getting on this is not the standard containers, but BusyBox is the one I get asked about the most. And that's one I would definitely deep dive into if you're using an environment, because it's like having a full Linux, and that means you've got a lot of also vectors for somebody to try and come in and do to your environment. And they're basically limiting the processes that BusyBox containers allowed to start. And to me, one of the more interesting ones to talk about is isolating the containers, right? People say they're isolated in a standard container, barring vulnerabilities, which never happen, right? It should be contained, right? There's been a number out there, and I'm really interested in the session that's here in a half hour to see what news come along. But the one thing that interested me most, we had a large bank come to us and say, I'm about to let this to roll out, but you have to prove to me we've got a way to meet this use case. And it was pretty interesting. So in Docker, there's something called docker.sock, right? It's an elevated privilege that all the researchers will tell you don't allow it. Just say it's not allowed. But then they also, on the flip side, say, well, for Nginx to work as a reverse proxy and MySQL to interact with HTTP in a high availability mode, you have to give those containers that right. Right? And so those containers are running in a mode where they have full access to talk to the rest of the containers to do the good things they need to do. But it also then opens up a nefarious way where a container can be used to take over the operating system. Right? In this particular case, and I'm not sure if this actually happened to them, theirs was, right, they've got separation of duties. The Docker admin can run the containers. So he needed to add a new user, and he then could use the Docker host to fire up, and the way it works is you basically fire up a Docker running on top of Docker, and then you can set a Linux above that, and then you can own the OS. And so his was, prove to me that I can let these containers have the ability to run without being able to get to the root OS, right? And their bigger security concern on these containers is make sure that when a vulnerability and the next thing comes down the road, we've got a way to truly isolate the containers from Docker from the host. And so there are a number of things. SE Linux, obviously Symantec, AppArmor are the things in this space that give you that control. And it's basically applying controls that take the containers and place them in a sandbox and limiting their access. Right? In this known one, right, you can go after it with an AppArmor or an SE Linux because you know the commands, right? It's well documented exactly how they would go about doing these containers. So what I wanted to end with is, right, what are your container use cases? If you had something pop up that I didn't cover that you're trying to struggle with, right? They're bringing containers into my environment and I'm struggling to get a handle on it, because what I'm very interested in is I continue to research, and Symantec, we continue to develop on how can I take and build a product that is able to secure containers and fully monitor and make sure we're building towards the right use cases. So does anybody have containers in production, right? Actually running your websites, running your company? Okay. So the one thing I would ask, right, I have started a blog, right? We actually took a product to market in September. We're up at the booth. We're always happy to talk. But the thing to me is I want people to share, right? I am not just going to say, oh, just buy Symantec. I've got a blog where I'm talking about obviously what we're doing, but I'd be happy to post anything about here's what we know of, the stuff that's in SE Linux, AppArmor, et cetera. It's about helping people secure containers because we want to enable it. I think it's a great way for companies to quickly build mobile apps, quickly scale them, and it solves a lot of problems for the development community. But obviously, we're going to have to get a handle on security and making sure we secure those. Okay, thanks, everyone.